The air outside the PX was sharp and cold, the kind of cold that makes every sound feel louder. My boots hit the concrete with the rhythm of someone who had marched too many miles. I had just finished a long day on base when I saw him sitting near the entrance. A man in a faded army field jacket was hunched over his hands, trembling around a paper bag. His face was worn, the kind of face you see on people who once stood tall but have been forgotten by everyone. His name, I would learn later, was Earl Thompson, a Vietnam veteran who had more stories in his eyes than anyone could tell. At that moment, he was just a man trying to hold on to a little dignity. He walked inside, slowly clutching a bottle of cheap pain medication and a few groceries. I saw the way the cashier looked at him when he came up short on the total. The line grew quiet. People stared at the floor. I had no plan to step in, but my feet moved before my head caught up. I pulled out my card and paid the $62. Earl froze. His voice cracked as he whispered that I didn't have to. I just said I want to. It was simple. It was right. But in my family, simple kindness was a crime. My parents were standing by the door watching. Walter and Marie Holt, people who cared more about reputation than decency. My father's jaw was tight. My mother's lips curled in that quiet way she did when she thought something was beneath her. They didn't say a word there, but their eyes said enough. To them, I hadn't just helped someone. I had humiliated them. The car ride home was silent, but not the peaceful kind. It was the kind where every breath feels too loud. When the front door closed behind us, my father's voice finally cracked through. "Do you have any idea how that looked? A staff sergeant throwing money at some washed-up old man." My mother added that Colonel Hayes would never take me seriously if I kept showing such weakness. She used that word a lot. Weakness. The argument built fast, climbing in volume like a storm you can't stop. My father took a step forward, his breath heavy with bourbon. He said I had embarrassed him, embarrassed the family, embarrassed everything he believed in. My mother stood with her arms crossed, judging from a distance. She didn't have to say much. She had perfected cruelty in silence. Then came the sound I will never forget. His hand struck my face. Sharp, clean, final. I didn't cry. Not this time. I just stared back at him. Something in me cracked, but not in the way he expected. He wanted submission. What he got was a wall of ice. My mother didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. To them, this was just discipline. To me, it was the moment the ground shifted beneath my feet. My father lowered his voice the way he always did after he crossed a line. He said I needed to understand what mattered, that helping people like Earl wasn't honorable. It was weak, that I made us look like fools. For a long time, I believed him when he said things like that. That night, I stopped. I walked to my room without another word. My cheek burned. My heart felt heavier than my rucksack after a field march. I had survived inspections, endless drills, and nights when I thought I couldn't push through. But nothing ever hit as hard as being told that doing the right thing was a disgrace. As I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed the moment at the PX. Earl's trembling hands, the way his voice cracked, the way my parents looked at me like I had spat on the family name. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty for disappointing them. I felt cold, focused, ready. That night was not just another fight. It was the moment I understood that kindness in their house was shame, that helping a man who had served this country was in their eyes an act of betrayal. If you were me standing in a house where decency was treated like a stain, would you stay silent or would you fight back? I grew up believing that the world outside our front door was made of rules that never bent. My father, Walter Holt, built his life around those rules. He had been a soldier stationed at Fort Bragg back when the world still seemed black and white to him. He was the kind of man who ironed his shirts 3 times before a ceremony and measured respect by how straight someone stood at attention. My mother, Marie, was different in form but not in heart. She didn't care about the army the way he did. She cared about what the army could give her: prestige, access, the sense of being someone people watched when she walked into a room. She wore reputation like it was a tailored suit, perfectly pressed without a single crease. As their only child, I was never asked what I wanted. I was told. My father decided early that my future would follow the family's so-called legacy. My mother polished that future like a trophy meant to be displayed. I became the perfect soldier on paper long before I ever put on the uniform. Even as a child, I remember the way my father's voice could make the house go still. He talked about honor the way some people talked about faith. He used words like duty and legacy as if they were carved in stone. I thought it was love at first. I thought they were strict because they wanted me safe, because they believed I could be great. But love doesn't bruise your heart when you make the wrong choice. Love doesn't measure your worth in medals and flawless appearances. For years, I lived inside that illusion, pushing myself to be everything they wanted. I became the top of my class in basic. I ran until my lungs burned. I pushed through everything they said I must overcome. And yet, no matter how hard I worked, I was never enough. My father's praise came wrapped in correction. My mother's pride came with conditions. Fort Liberty in November carries a chill that creeps into your bones. The air gets quiet before Thanksgiving, like the base itself is holding its breath. Soldiers talk about travel plans. Commissary shelves start filling with pies and turkeys. People smile more than usual. But in my house, this time of year was never soft. It was when appearances mattered most. This year was worse. Colonel Marcus Hayes had invited a small group of senior NCOs and officers to his home for a formal dinner. I wasn't a guest by choice. I was expected to show up, look perfect, and make the Holt name shine. My father repeated it like scripture. Do not make us look weak. Walter and Marie spent the entire week talking about what I should wear, how I should stand, when to smile. It wasn't about me. It was about them. My mother hovered over me with a pearl necklace in hand, telling me to keep my hair sleek, my posture straight, and my mouth quiet. My father reminded me that Colonel Hayes was an influential man, that my future depended on how the Holt family was perceived. He looked me in the eye and said, "Don't do anything stupid, Reagan. This is not the place for your rescue missions." His words were like ice water down my spine. Just hours earlier, he had called my compassion a humiliation. Now he was polishing me like a prop for his reputation. There was a time I might have believed him. There was a time when I mistook control for care. But as I stood in front of the mirror that evening, pressing the last wrinkle out of my uniform, I caught my own reflection and saw something different. The girl who spent her life trying to earn their approval wasn't looking back at me anymore. My cheek still ached faintly from his hand. It wasn't just skin that burned, it was trust unraveling at the seams. The house smelled like lemon polish and anxiety. Marie adjusted the collar of my jacket as if she were straightening her own reflection. She said I should smile with my lips, but not my teeth. She said kindness made people uneasy. I thought about Earl sitting outside the PX, about the way his hands trembled. My father wanted me to be a soldier of image. My mother wanted me to be a weapon of presentation. But somewhere in between those two, a different part of me was waking up. The night outside was cold. I could hear the faint echo of the bass loudspeaker and the sound of boots from a late training rotation. Those sounds used to give me comfort. They meant order, stability, but now they sounded like chains. Every step of my career had been planned for me by someone else. Every achievement I had made was followed by their voice telling me how to stand taller, how to smile less, how to fit into a box I had never built. Walter stood in the living room wearing a pressed suit. He wasn't in uniform anymore, but he still carried himself like a man who believed the rank lived inside his bones. He said something about how the dinner was a chance for me to prove I was worthy of the Holt name. He didn't say a word about me as a person, just the name, the family, the image. It used to make me feel small. That night, it made me angry. Quiet anger, the kind that sits deep in your chest and hums like a low engine. I thought about how hard I'd worked to make them proud, how I had believed their harshness was love. But what kind of love breaks you for doing good? What kind of family measures worth in how well you hide your heart? The slap wasn't just a moment of violence. It was the proof of everything I had been trying not to see. For the first time, I started to wonder what my life might look like if I stopped being their perfect soldier. The dinner wasn't just another social event. It was the stage they had built to prove something. I didn't know to whom, to Colonel Hayes, to the community, to the world. But I was the one expected to play the part. Perfect posture, perfect smile, perfect silence. As I zipped up my jacket and pulled my hair back into a tight bun, my hands shook a little. Not from fear, from clarity. It was the first time I truly questioned whether their love had ever been love at all. I didn't have answers yet, but I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, and I knew something inside me had started to move. The morning air was crisp enough to sting my nose as I walked back toward the PX. The sky was still a pale blue, the kind of quiet that only exists before the day really begins. I had a prescription to pick up something routine, nothing more. I didn't expect to see him again. Earl was standing near the same spot as the night before, this time upright, holding a paper cup of cheap coffee someone must have given him. His posture was stiff. His hands still shook slightly, but his eyes lifted when he saw me. For a moment, his face softened in a way that made everything around us fade into the background. He stepped closer and reached out his hand. It trembled as he wrapped his fingers around mine. His grip was frail but sincere. He said quietly with a kind of rasp that only comes from years of living hard, "No one's kind like that anymore, kid." I swallowed before I could speak. I hadn't done anything extraordinary, but to him it had meant something real. I asked if he'd eaten. He smiled a tired smile and said he had managed. There was a small glint of pride in his eyes that told me he wasn't someone used to accepting help. Then I saw the patch on his jacket more clearly. Airborne. Old, faded, but unmistakable. I'd grown up seeing that patch hanging in a display case in my father's office. I asked him quietly when he'd served. His answer hit like a cold wind. 74. Fort Bragg. I froze because that was exactly where my father had been stationed at the same time. I said my father's name without thinking Walter Holt. Earl's eyes flickered. He straightened slightly as if the name pulled a part of him back from the fog. "Walter? Hell, we jumped together once. Crazy bastard." He laughed softly, and it was a real laugh like the kind my father used to have before everything turned into rules and control. Then Earl reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small rusted badge. It was a jump wing's pin edges dulled with time. He rolled it between his fingers like it was something sacred. In that moment, the edges of the world I'd grown up in started to crack. My father had spent my entire life talking about the golden years of service, the glory, the pride, the brotherhood. He had painted it like a legacy, something noble and untouchable. But when he saw Earl outside the PX, there had been no brotherhood in his eyes, only disgust. I remembered him telling stories at the dinner table talking about how soldiers never leave their own behind. I was old enough now to know that some men love the uniform more than the people who wear it. My father, the man who had built his life on appearances, had walked past a man he once jumped out of planes with like he was trash. Earl tucked the pin back into his jacket and said something I'll never forget. "Some of us came home kid, but not all of us stayed the same." He patted my arm and walked away slowly, his steps heavy but dignified. I stood there longer than I meant to. The chill bit through my uniform, but it wasn't the cold that made me shiver. It was the realization that the man I had spent my life trying to impress had already betrayed the very values he preached. I went back home carrying that rusted pin in my head like a stone. My parents were already circling the living room like Hawks Marie with a garment bag in her hands, and Walter on the phone giving orders to someone like he was still in charge of the whole base. When I walked in, they didn't ask about my morning. They didn't ask about Earl. They didn't ask anything. My mother thrust the garment bag toward me like it was a mission directive. "Try this on. It needs to fit perfectly." She started talking about the dinner again the way she'd been talking for days. Every word was about appearances. "Stand straight, speak when spoken to, smile the right amount, never mention the PX, never mention Earl. Don't bring your charity cases to a place where people matter." I tried to breathe, but the house felt smaller with every word. Walter hung up the phone and looked at me the way he always did before an event like a coach before a game. "Remember who you represent?" he said. "Not yourself. Us, the family." I wondered if he even realized how often he said that, how rarely the word me had ever entered his mouth when it came to me. I thought about Earl standing there in the cold with a rusted badge in his hand. That was real. It wasn't polished or perfect, but it was real. and my father, who once wore the same wings, couldn't see that. Or worse, chose not to. The weight of that choice pressed on me harder than the bruise on my cheek. I had spent years defending him to myself, convincing myself that his harshness came from love, that his cruelty was discipline, that he was making me strong. But that morning, those excuses started to feel like ash in my mouth. Marie was still talking, her voice smooth and sharp at the same time. She told me how to wear my hair, what shade of lipstick not to use, how to make sure the colonel's wife would see me as refined. She laughed when I didn't respond. Just look like an officer's daughter, Reagan. Don't talk like one of those pathetic people you love to save. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone, as if compassion was something filthy that clung to me like mud on my boots, something she needed me to wash off before stepping into her version of respectability. The bitter taste in my throat was new. It wasn't fear this time. It was disillusionment, raw and sharp. I didn't want to fight them yet. Not here, not now. But for the first time, I didn't want to defend them either. My father wasn't a hero. He was a man who abandoned his own principles for the comfort of being respected by strangers. My mother wasn't a victim. She was the architect of the mask he wore. I stood in the hallway clutching the garment bag as they kept talking. Their words blurred into noise. All I could see in my head was Earl's trembling hand around that rusted badge. A man who had lost almost everything still held on to honor, and a man who had everything had thrown his away. I realized then that the dinner wasn't just some gathering. It was a test. But not for me. Not really. It was a stage built for their image. I was the polished prop they planned to parade. And if I dared to be anything else, if I dared to be myself, I'd be the disgrace they always warned me about. The sun outside was bright, too bright for November. It streamed through the blinds, slicing the room into harsh lines. That light used to make me feel safe. That morning it made everything look sharper, uglier, more real. My father's voice snapped back into focus. Be perfect, Reagan. Just once in your life, don't make me regret putting my name on your uniform. I held my breath, and something inside me finally broke. I didn't say it out loud, not yet, but I thought it with a clarity that scared me. I'm not yours to display anymore. I learned a long time ago that the first step to fighting people like my parents wasn't yelling back. It was listening. Quietly. Carefully. My father had taught me discipline, and in a cruel twist, I was going to use it against him. That night, after their usual tirade about the dinner, I sat in my room with my phone face down on the desk, the recording app quietly running. The walls in that house had heard a lifetime of their words, but this time they wouldn't just bounce back into silence. My father's voice filled the hallway, sharp and bitter. He wasn't even talking to me, just talking at me the way he always did. Words like embarrassment, failure, weakness spilled from his mouth like practiced lines. My mother's voice followed smooth but poisonous, slicing through any attempt at peace. She called me soft, called me pathetic for helping a man like Earl. I didn't flinch this time. I just let the phone keep recording. Every word was a nail they were hammering into their own coffin without realizing it. The next morning, between PT and work, I made a quiet detour to the legal office near the admin building. Captain Lisa Monroe had been a friend since AIT. Someone who actually understood what it meant to live under pressure. She greeted me with a half smile, the kind you give someone you haven't seen in too long but already know something's wrong. I didn't give her the full story right away. I just said hypothetically what would happen if someone had proof of physical and emotional abuse from family members who were also dependents on base. She didn't hesitate. If you have proof, Reagan, you can do more than keep your mouth shut. You can file a report. You can get protection. You can make them answer for it. Her voice was calm, measured, not full of empty comfort. It was the voice of someone who had seen too many people stay quiet. I told her I wasn't ready to file anything yet. She didn't push. She just said, keep recording. That afternoon, I found Earl again near the PX. He was sitting on a bench with a cup of hot coffee, watching the flags sway in the wind. The air was colder than the day before, and his jacket wasn't doing much against it. I had dug through my old storage that morning and found an extra field jacket from my last training rotation. It was clean, sturdy, still held the faint smell of detergent. I walked over and handed it to him without a speech. He stared at it for a moment, then at me, and his eyes filled with something I hadn't expected to see: tears. His hands shook as he held the fabric. He tried to say something, but the words caught in his throat. So he just nodded. That nod said everything. He had been invisible for so long that a simple act of kindness felt like a miracle. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small around my parents. I felt steady. Quiet power hummed beneath the surface like an engine warming. When I walked back home, I didn't walk like a child returning to an authoritarian house. I walked like someone gathering evidence piece by piece. I had recorded 3 different tirades in less than 2 days. My mother's favorite line had already been caught on audio: "Don't talk like one of those pathetic people you love to save." That sentence alone burned in my chest. I wasn't going to let it sit there anymore. The night before the dinner, everything boiled to the surface. Walter had been pacing the living room wearing the same expression he used before: inspection's tight jaw, clenched hands, eyes that scanned for weaknesses. When I walked in, he asked me where I'd been. I didn't answer. That was enough. He followed me down the hallway, raising his voice louder with every step. "You went to see him again, didn't you? That man, that disgrace, that trash." His voice cracked on the last word. For a moment, I saw something almost desperate in his eyes. It wasn't love. It was fear of being seen as less than the perfect man he pretended to be. I didn't deny it. I didn't explain. I didn't do anything. I just stood there in my uniform, hands still at my sides, my face calm. He exploded. He called me the shame of this family, a stain on the Holt name. He said the colonel would laugh at me, that the entire community would see me for what I was. That word, shame, it used to feel like a knife. Now it felt dull. He hadn't realized it yet, but the control he had over me was cracking like thin glass. My mother appeared from the kitchen, arms crossed, that familiar look of disdain already in place. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. Her silence was sharper than his words. She tilted her head and said softly, like she was making an observation about the weather, "You'll ruin everything." And for the first time, I realized something I should have known years ago. Their anger wasn't about me. It was about their reflection. I wasn't their daughter to them. I was their mirror. And right now, I wasn't reflecting what they wanted to see. I went upstairs while Walter was still shouting. I didn't bother slamming the door. I didn't need to. I sat on the edge of my bed and pressed play on my phone. Their voices filled the room, their cruelty now something tangible, real, no longer just living in my head. I listened to my father calling me a disgrace and my mother cutting me down with every breath. And the strangest thing happened. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I felt clear. I had spent years trying to argue with people who were never going to hear me. Now, I didn't need them to. As I closed the file and locked my phone, I realized I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I wasn't just enduring them anymore. I was preparing for war, not the kind fought with rifles and ranks, but the kind where truth is the weapon. I didn't have a full plan yet, but I had something they never expected me to have: proof. And the quiet certainty that their grip on me was slipping with every word I captured. Downstairs, I could still hear Walter's voice echoing through the house. It no longer sounded like power. It sounded like noise. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes weren't soft anymore. They were cold, focused, calculated. For the first time in my life, they weren't the only ones holding the cards. The night of the dinner carried the kind of cold that seeps into your chest no matter how many layers you wear. The Holt family house smelled of starch and polished leather. My uniform fit perfectly, every crease pressed, every ribbon straight, every piece of me arranged like a display case version of who they wanted me to be. My father's hand clamped down on my shoulder as we stood by the door. "Remember who you represent." His eyes burned with expectation. My mother hovered like a shadow, fixing invisible flaws on my collar, smoothing fabric that didn't need smoothing. She whispered the same line she always did before an event that mattered to them. "Smile just enough, Reagan. Don't speak unless someone important asks you to." I didn't answer. Inside, the quiet hum of something colder than the November wind settled in. I wasn't walking into that house tonight to play their perfect daughter. I was walking in with a mind sharp as a blade. Colonel Marcus Hayes's home sat on a slight rise overlooking the base perimeter, all clean lines and glowing windows. It was a house that carried the weight of rank, the kind of place my parents worshipped without ever saying so. Cars lined the driveway, their owners already inside a collection of uniforms and polished shoes, laughter wrapped in discipline. As we approached, my father straightened his tie, even though he wasn't in uniform, a habit he never shook from his service years. My mother's chin lifted, scanning the crowd like a queen arriving at court. I walked between them, a soldier wrapped in silence. The moment we stepped through the door, warmth and chatter flooded around us. Officers, spouses, high-ranking NCOs, people my parents admired and envied in equal measure. Colonel Hayes stood near the grand fireplace, the kind that made everything look expensive without needing to be. He was a tall man with calm eyes, the kind of leader people didn't fear, but respected deeply. And beside him, wearing a dark, slightly frayed suit that still held a quiet dignity, stood Earl Thompson. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but it was him. His back was straight, the airborne patch visible on the lapel of his jacket like a quiet declaration of who he'd once been. His hands didn't shake now. Not here. And then it happened, the twist I never saw coming. Colonel Hayes placed a steady hand on Earl's shoulder as he greeted guests. When he turned to address the room, his voice carried the warmth of someone who meant what he said. "Before we begin, I'd like to introduce someone important to me. This is my uncle Earl Thompson. Some of you may remember his service. Special Forces. Airborne. The man who taught me to jump out of planes before I could even drive." A ripple moved through the room. Not just polite acknowledgement. Real respect. This wasn't just any man. He was family to the colonel. A veteran whose name clearly meant something to the people in this room. My heart pounded against my ribs. The same man my father had called trash outside the PX was now standing in the most respected living room on base, introduced like a war hero. I saw my father's shoulders stiffen the second he recognized him. My mother's painted smile faltered for half a breath. Their carefully constructed world had just collided with a truth they couldn't control. Earl looked around the room with quiet composure, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. He wasn't the forgotten man outside the PX anymore. He belonged here more than they did. When his eyes landed on me, something flickered. Recognition, maybe gratitude, but also a shared understanding. He gave a small nod. My father followed his gaze, and I saw it. The moment he realized what I already knew. This night wasn't going to belong to him. Dinner was set at a long mahogany table covered in linen and gold-rimmed plates. My parents slipped into their roles easily. My father laughed too loudly. My mother leaned just a little too far toward the colonel's wife. I sat silently listening, my hands resting lightly on the tablecloth. It was all too perfect, too rehearsed. But beneath it, something was shifting. When the colonel stood to speak, everyone quieted as if on cue. It was the kind of silence that carries weight. He talked about Thanksgiving, about gratitude, about service. Then his voice softened when he looked at Earl. He said there are people whose courage goes unseen, who give everything and ask for nothing, and how sometimes the smallest kindness can remind us who we are. Then with deliberate care he said, "A soldier I admired deeply reminded me of that this week." The room turned with him. All those polished faces, all those careful smiles. And then Earl spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. "She didn't ask who I was. She just helped me." Simple words. But they hit the room like a pin dropped in a cathedral. You could hear every breath people didn't take. The kind of silence that has meaning. I saw it in their faces. Some of them glanced at me, others at Earl. My father's hands tightened around his glass until his knuckles went white. My mother's mouth stayed fixed in its practiced smile, but her eyes were screaming. The twist wasn't just that I had helped a stranger. It was that the stranger mattered more in this room than they did. Earl didn't tell the whole story. He didn't talk about the slap. He didn't talk about the way my parents looked at him like he was nothing. He just told the part that mattered. The part about kindness, about how someone saw him when the world didn't, and that was enough to shift the air in the room. The officers didn't look at me like I was weak. They looked at me like I had done something they respected. I glanced at my father then. His face was pale beneath the tan, his jaw tight. He had spent his entire life building walls of status and control. In one quiet moment, they cracked. My mother adjusted her necklace, the pearls catching the chandelier light like it mattered. But the performance was done. They couldn't outshine what had already been said. Colonel Hayes walked over to Earl and placed a hand on his shoulder again, this time more like family than ceremony. Earl looked at me and said softly, "This is the soldier who reminded me the army still raises good ones." The colonel's eyebrows lifted slightly and he smiled. His respect was effortless, not something my father could fake his way into. I felt something in my chest loosen like a knot that had been there too long. For years, my parents made me believe my worth depended on how well I played their game. But here, in this room full of people they worshipped, my worth had spoken without me saying a single word, and it came from the very act they had punished me for. My father tried to lean forward, forcing a laugh, attempting to steer the conversation away, but the colonel wasn't interested in him. The people at the table weren't either. The gravity of the room had shifted, and my father wasn't the center anymore. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat, but inside I felt a quiet pulse of power. I sat up a little straighter. My voice had never been loud, but tonight it didn't have to be. It was already echoing through the room in someone else's words. If you were in that room, surrounded by the people who had defined your worth for years, and suddenly saw them lose the ground they stood on, would you stand up for yourself or keep your head down to keep their peace? The clinking of glasses and low hum of conversation faded the second Colonel Hayes rose from his chair. He was the kind of man whose presence naturally commanded a room, and in that moment, every officer, every spouse, and every family member fell silent without needing to be told. His voice carried a steady authority, the kind born not from power, but from respect. He looked directly at me, and my heart beat against my ribs like it was trying to escape. "Reagan Holt!" he began, and the sound of my name in his calm, clear tone cut through the air like a clean blade. "Tonight, I want to acknowledge something simple but powerful. In a world that can turn hard, it takes real courage to be kind." His hand gestured toward me as he continued. "This soldier saw a man outside the PX who most people would have walked past without a second thought. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't measure his worth. She just helped. That's the kind of integrity that builds this army." A hush fell over the room. I felt every pair of eyes settle on me. My father was standing to my right, his face pale, his jaw locked so tight I could hear the muscle in it ticking like a clock. My mother's hand rested lightly on his arm, not as a gesture of comfort, but as a warning. Colonel Hayes moved closer, his expression still composed, but now sharper, more focused. "Reagan, would you like to say something?" His tone was respectful, but the question left no room to hide. I could feel my father's silent plea pressing down on me like a hand on my throat. The daughter they wanted me to be would smile politely, deflect, play their game, but that version of me was gone. I inhaled slowly and met the colonel's gaze head on, and for that, I got beaten at home. The words left my mouth quiet, but solid. They fell into the air like a single stone, hitting still water, and the ripples spread instantly. The room went dead silent, not awkward silent, not polite silent, the kind of silence that splits the air in two. My father's knuckles went white on the back of the chair he was gripping. My mother's practiced smile froze mid-curve. You could feel the weight of the truth land on every person in that room. It wasn't just my words. It was the audacity of saying them here in this house in front of people who defined their status. Colonel Hayes's eyes hardened not in anger at me, but in a way that made the air colder. He didn't need an explanation. The man beside him was a soldier who had seen what cruelty looked like in all its shapes. He recognized the tone of someone who wasn't exaggerating. He stepped closer and spoke softly but firmly. "Reagan, did I hear that right?" My voice didn't waver. "Yes, sir." I saw Lisa Monroe at the edge of the crowd. She had been invited as a guest, too. Her presence wasn't an accident. When I had called her earlier that week, she hadn't given me advice for nothing. She stood with her hands clasped, her expression unreadable but alert. Colonel Hayes turned slightly toward her. Lisa Monroe. JAG. Her nod was small but definitive. If this is what happened, sir, it falls under both UCMJ considerations and civilian reporting protocols. The quiet hum of legal language in that setting was like striking a match near dry timber. My father stepped forward, his voice hoarse. That's not what happened. She's... He paused, realizing how many people were listening. She's exaggerating. It was a family disagreement, a misunderstanding. His words stumbled over themselves, brittle and desperate. My mother followed suit, her voice smooth, trying to weave their old narrative like silk. Reagan has always been dramatic. She gets emotional, and sometimes she twists things. We love her. We'd never hurt her. Her tone was rehearsed, too polished, like she had practiced it in the mirror for years. But the air had changed. I didn't have to convince anyone. I just had to show them the truth they thought they could bury behind pretty words. I reached into the inside pocket of my uniform, pulled out my phone, unlocked it with my thumb, and opened the recording app. For a moment, the small, blinking red dot on the screen felt louder than anything in the room. I hit play. The sound of my father's voice roared through the speakers. "You're a disgrace!" The slap came next, sharp, undeniable. Then my mother's smooth, cutting tone. "Just look like an officer's daughter. Don't talk like those pathetic people you love to save." The entire room held its breath. There was no mistaking it, no misunderstanding. No family argument could make a sound like that disappear. My father's face drained of color completely. My mother's hand fell from his arm. Someone at the table shifted the soft scrape of a chair leg, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. Colonel Hayes's expression hardened further, his jaw tightening, his posture going rigid in the way soldiers do when something serious happens. Earl stood a few steps behind him, his eyes fixed on my father, the same man who had looked at him like trash outside the PX. And now here in front of the entire room, the power dynamic flipped like a coin. Walter opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Marie tried again, softer this time, almost trembling. "Reagan, sweetheart, you're making a mistake. We can talk about this at home." I met her eyes without blinking. "You made sure home was the problem." The colonel raised his hand slightly, and the murmurs stopped before they could even start. His voice when he spoke again was steel wrapped in calm. "Sergeant Holt, thank you for your honesty." And then turning to my parents, his tone dropped lower. "Walter Holt, I knew you in uniform. I never imagined I'd hear something like this." The weight behind his words was heavier than shouting. My father flinched like the silence itself was crushing him. Lisa stepped forward slightly, professional, composed. "Sir, since there's clear audio evidence of assault, the proper channels would be CID and family advocacy. It's a serious matter." Several officers shifted uncomfortably, not because they doubted me, but because the lines between personal and professional had just exploded in front of them. My father's world had been built on reputation, and in one night that reputation was cracking loud enough for everyone to hear. My mother's voice broke for the first time. "Reagan, please, don't do this. Think of the family." I stared at her, remembering every moment she'd stood silent when it mattered, every time she'd smoothed the wrinkles out of his violence, like it was just a crease in a uniform. I thought of the way she'd watched me bleed and said nothing. "This is me thinking of the family," I said softly. Earl shifted beside the colonel, his shoulders squared. The colonel placed a hand on his uncle's arm, but didn't look away from my parents. "Walter Marie, I suggest you leave my house. Now." It wasn't a shout. It didn't need to be. My father looked in the faces around him and saw what I had always seen. Their approval was his lifeline. And it was gone. He straightened his jacket like he could stitch it all back together, but the threads were already torn. My mother blinked rapidly, her mask finally slipping. They walked out into the freezing night without another word. The room remained silent. No one rushed to fill the space with meaningless platitudes. The sound of the recording still lingered like smoke after a fire. The colonel turned to me. His voice was steady, respectful. "Sergeant Holt, we will handle this properly. You did the right thing." Earl nodded, his eyes glistening not with pity but with pride. In that moment, I wasn't the disgrace they had spent years convincing me I was. I was the one standing while their empire of silence collapsed around them. The weight of their control, their shame, their carefully curated image fell away, and all that was left was the truth. The truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be heard once. The morning after the dinner, the sky over Fort Liberty was an unforgiving steel gray, the kind that strips away illusions. I stood outside the JAG office with my hands in the pockets of my uniform jacket, feeling the chill bite through the seams. The night before had ripped the mask off everything, and now what came next wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about action. Colonel Hayes had made it clear as soon as my parents walked out of his house, this wasn't something to be buried. It was going straight through the proper channels. Military Family Advocacy, CID, real consequences. For years, I had been the one absorbing the blows, hiding the bruises in silence, because that was what kept the peace. But silence no longer served me. Now it served them. And last night, I had taken it away. Captain Lisa Monroe met me at the door with a firm nod. She didn't speak to me like I was a victim. She spoke to me like a soldier with a mission. We sat down at her desk, stacks of legal pads and case files lining the walls, the sterile scent of government-issued furniture lingering in the air. She pushed a form across the table. This is the official report. Once it's filed, everything moves quickly. Are you sure? I didn't hesitate. Yes. She slid a pen toward me, and the sound of it scratching against paper was the cleanest noise I'd ever heard. Within hours, the process unfolded like a well-drilled maneuver. Colonel Hayes made the formal notification to the Family Advocacy Program. The CID office scheduled interviews. Because I was active duty and my parents were dependents, the base had jurisdiction. There would be investigations, restricted access documentation hearings. I knew all this from the briefings we'd sat through over the years. I'd just never imagined I'd be on this side of it, but it didn't scare me. Not anymore. Walter Holt received the first order that afternoon, a temporary restriction barring him from entering Fort Liberty property. He had spent decades parading his status as a retired officer, moving through the base like it belonged to him. Now he needed special clearance just to step through the gate. I didn't have to see his face to know what that did to him. A man like him built his identity on access, on power, on being seen. Stripping that away was the first crack in the foundation he thought was unshakable. Marie Holt got her own version of exile. She wasn't officially under investigation, but the news from the dinner had traveled fast. The officer-spouse network was its own ecosystem, polished, powerful, merciless. It didn't matter how carefully she tried to spin her version. In a community that worshipped appearances, being exposed publicly was worse than being punished legally. By evening, the wives she had once charmed at brunch turned their faces cold. Her name fell out of their circles like it had never existed. She had built her world on being untouchable. Now she was the woman people whispered about behind their hands. I packed my bags that night. Not in panic, not in shame. Methodically. Folded uniforms, boots polished to regulation standard, a few old photos that belonged to me and not to the version of me they had tried to shape. The house I grew up in felt smaller than it ever had. Every wall held echoes of slammed doors, cutting words, bruised silences. I walked through the hallway without looking back. My father's voice wasn't there to bark at me. My mother's sighs weren't there to guilt me. Just the sound of my boots on hardwood. I moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment on base housing near the south gate. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. The first night alone, I sat on the floor between 2 boxes with a cup of bitter black coffee and listened to the quiet. Real quiet. Not the kind that comes from holding your breath so someone else doesn't explode. The kind that comes from freedom. Over the next few days, everything moved faster than I expected. Lisa coordinated with CID. I sat through interviews, reviewed statements, handed over the recordings I'd kept. No tears, no shaky hands. Just facts. For the first time, I wasn't the one trapped reacting. I was the one setting the course. My father tried to send messages through old friends, people who'd once praised him at barbecues and balls. Most of them didn't want to get involved. The Colonel's public support of me had made it clear this wasn't a story they could spin away. The look on his face the day he was escorted to turn in his base access pass must have been something to see. I wasn't there in person, but word travels. Retired or not, he had to stand at the visitor's desk like any other outsider. His voice had always carried power when he walked through the gate. Now it was just another sound in a line of names. Marie, meanwhile, tried to wage her war in whispers. She called mutual acquaintances, cried about betrayal, tried to cast herself as the mother of a difficult, ungrateful daughter. But the audio clip from that dinner had traveled too. Someone had recorded the moment I pressed play. It wasn't just between us anymore. It was between them and an entire community that had spent years watching them play perfect. Their silence used to make me feel small. Now it made them look like liars. When the family advocacy program briefed me on protective measures, it was strange at first. A security contact on file, a no-contact order, a direct line to my commanding officer. It wasn't the kind of power I had ever wanted, but it was the kind that meant I no longer had to flinch when the phone rang. I still went to work every morning. I trained. I stood in formation. My life didn't stop because they had finally been forced to face consequences. If anything, it became sharper, more focused. My CO called me in after a unit briefing one morning. He didn't ask for details. He just said, "You've got a lot of people behind you, Staff Sergeant." That simple acknowledgement meant more than I could admit out loud. At night, I sometimes stopped by the PX. Earl was often there now, not sitting on the ground, but at a small corner table wearing the field jacket I'd given him. The difference in him was almost as stark as the difference in me. When he saw me, he'd nod like an old soldier acknowledging another. No long speeches, just quiet respect. Lisa came by the apartment one evening with a folder of updates. She laid everything out like a briefing CID interviews, scheduled hearings, pending timelines. Her voice was steady matter of fact. She didn't treat me like I was fragile. She treated me like someone who had already fought a battle and was now planning the next phase. "You've done everything right so far," she said as she closed the folder. "Keep standing your ground." I thought back to every night in that house where I'd sat on the floor of my room pretending the walls were soundproof. Back then, I used to believe that their power was permanent, that being their daughter meant I was bound to it forever. But power is fragile when it's built on silence. Walter Holt had spent decades controlling every narrative around him. One recording had shattered it. One truth spoken in the right room had made him smaller than he'd ever made me feel. Marie's polished mask had cracked, not because I screamed louder, but because I stopped playing along. Standing at the window of my apartment, I could see the faint lights of the base stretching out into the night. For the first time, the world felt wide open, not like a cage. I wasn't the girl who came home to bruises and bit her tongue anymore. I was the soldier who filed the report, who held the proof, who stood in the colonel's house and said the words out loud. Revenge, I learned, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet sound of locks changing of access, revoked of whispers turning on the people who once controlled everything. Sometimes revenge isn't about hurting back. It's about reclaiming every inch they took. I didn't need to scream at my father or beg my mother to see me. The system they had hidden behind for years now belonged to me, and I was going to use it. It was late in the afternoon when the knock came at my door. Sharp, deliberate, the kind that belongs to someone who still believes they have the right to be heard. I didn't have to look through the peephole to know it was him. I could recognize that rhythm anywhere. Walter Holt had spent my entire childhood announcing himself like a king entering a room. I opened the door not because I wanted to see him, but because I wanted him to see me standing on my own ground. His once proud posture was a shadow of itself. His coat hung loose, his hair slightly unkempt, and for the first time in my life, I saw my father look small. His voice cracked when he said my name. Reagan. He didn't bark it like a command this time. He said it like a man trying to hold on to something slipping through his fingers. I didn't invite him in. I just stood in the doorway waiting. I heard my mother before I saw her. She was behind him clutching her coat at the collar, her face pale beneath a layer of careful makeup. Marie Holt, the woman who never stepped outside without looking perfect, now looked like someone standing in the wreckage of her own making. The silence stretched thin between us until my father broke it. I was wrong. His voice trembled around the words like he wasn't used to saying them. I was wrong, Reagan. About everything, about what matters, about you. You're the only thing this family has left to be proud of. There it was, the sentence he should have said years ago, the one he thought would undo everything. I didn't move. I didn't give him a flicker of relief. He looked at me like a drowning man searching for a rope. For so long his approval had been a mountain I climbed again and again, only to find the summit was made of air. But I wasn't climbing anymore. I had burned the mountain down. My mother stepped forward then. She didn't bother with pride. Her voice was soft, desperate, stripped of its usual polish. "Reagan, sweetheart, please. We can fix this. Just take it back." The complaint. It's humiliating. Everyone's talking. It's destroying us. She said the word us like it still meant something to me, like the bruises on my skin. The nights of silence, the slap that echoed in my head were part of some collective family story we all shared. I let her speak until her voice started to shake. She wasn't pleading for me. She was pleading for their image. My father stepped closer, lowering his voice like a man trying to reason with a soldier. "I know I can't take back what I did, but I can make it right. Just give me a chance. We'll face this as a family. We'll make it disappear." I almost laughed at that. He still didn't understand. This wasn't about making things disappear anymore. It was about making them stay, making them exist in the light where he couldn't twist them into something else. "If you were really proud," I said, my voice calm and steady, "then there wouldn't have been a slap that night. There wouldn't have been bruises. There wouldn't have been years of silence." My father froze. It wasn't the volume of my voice that hurt him. It was the fact that I wasn't shouting. Cold truth cuts deeper than rage. Marie reached for my arm the way she used to when she wanted to smooth things over, but I stepped back. "Don't," I said simply. She dropped her hand as if I'd burned her. Her eyes were wide now, not with anger, but with the realization that the version of me she could mold was gone. "We can't survive this. Reagan," she whispered. "Think about what they're saying. Think about what it means to have the Colonel against us." I tilted my head slightly. "I have. That's why I'm not stopping." Behind them, Earl appeared at the edge of the walkway. He'd been coming by more often lately, sometimes just to sit on the bench near the apartment complex. He was wearing the field jacket I gave him, hands tucked in the pockets, watching without interfering. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone was a reminder of why I had started all of this in the first place. He was the proof that kindness mattered more than the image my parents had worshipped. Walter's voice rose, just a little desperation bleeding into his tone. "They're tearing this family apart. You're tearing this family apart." I looked him dead in the eye. "No, you did that the moment your hand hit my face." The silence after that was sharp enough to draw blood. Lisa Monroe had already filed the paperwork. The investigation wasn't some looming possibility anymore. It was happening. CID had opened the case. Military Family Advocacy had issued their recommendations. My father was officially under investigation for domestic assault of an adult dependent. The same system he once used to maintain his status was now turning its gaze on him. There was no going back. Marie's breath came out in short, uneven bursts. She wasn't built for humiliation. Her world was made of smiles and polished manners, and now all of it was unraveling like thread. "Please, Reagan, if you drop the charges, they'll let it go. We can say it was a misunderstanding. We can make it stop." She sounded like someone begging a storm not to rain. I straightened my shoulders, my voice still quiet. "It's already stopped. For me." My father took another step forward, and for the first time, his voice cracked wide open. He wasn't the man from the dinner parties anymore. He wasn't the booming figure who barked orders in our living room. He was just an old man who realized too late that power built on fear isn't power at all. "Reagan, please." I shook my head slowly. "This isn't about hate, Dad. This is about truth. And truth doesn't care if it's inconvenient for you." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. The proof was there louder than any defense he could offer. Marie covered her mouth with her hand, tears finally spilling past the barrier of her vanity. Her words came out in a broken whisper. "What will we do?" I wanted to tell her that she should have thought about that years ago, when she watched and said nothing, when she chose appearances over me, but I didn't waste the words. They weren't owed. Earl shifted his weight, his voice finally cutting through the quiet. You raised a soldier, Walter, and now she's standing her ground. There was no anger in his tone, just truth. My father flinched like he'd been struck. I looked at them one last time. For years, I had dreamed of moments like this with fire in my veins, imagined shouting, breaking, crying. But standing here now, I felt none of that. Just clarity. Just the quiet strength of someone who has finally stopped waiting to be loved the way she deserved. I'm not dropping the case. I said each word clean and deliberate. His face fell like a structure losing its final support beam. Marie reached for him, but he didn't look at her. For once, the two of them weren't a united wall. They were just two people standing in the ruins of their own lies. Walter Holt, decorated veteran master of appearances, was officially a man under investigation. His base privileges were gone, his reputation was crumbling, and for the first time, I wasn't the one ashamed. Earl walked up the steps and stood beside me, not in front of me, not behind me. Beside me. My parents looked at the two of us and saw something they had never understood: strength that didn't need their approval. As they turned to leave, the air was thick with everything they didn't say. Regret. Desperation. But no apology, no plea could rewrite the past. They had spent a lifetime teaching me to keep my head down for the sake of family. Now they were learning what happens when the daughter they tried to control finally stands up. If the person who hurt you came back and begged, what would you do? Would you hand them the rope or let them live with the weight of their choices? The real weight of consequences doesn't fall all at once. It settles slowly, piece by piece, until it becomes the air you breathe. The investigation into my father started quietly but efficiently. CID doesn't waste time with theatrics. They asked for statements, reviewed the audio recording, interviewed witnesses. Colonel Hayes submitted his official report. Lisa Monroe handled my side with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. My father had spent years believing his rank and reputation made him untouchable, but when the machine of military justice turns its gaze on someone, there's nowhere to hide. The first blow came when CID issued a permanent restriction on his access to Fort Liberty. The man who had strutted through the gates like they were his birthright now had to sit outside the perimeter fence while MPs verified whether he was allowed through. He wasn't. Watching him stripped of that power was like watching a storm lose its thunder. His name no longer opened doors. His badge no longer meant anything. The air of untouchability he'd worn for so long vanished. The second blow came from the veterans community. My father had wrapped his identity around his service, around the idea of being respected. The recording from that night spread quietly but fast among the officer network. Not because I shared it, I didn't have to, but because rooms filled with uniforms talk. The Veterans Association removed him from their local honorary circle. His name was erased from their public list of speakers and donors. Men he had once shared stories and whiskey with avoided his calls. Silence became the only thing that answered him. For someone like Walter Holt, who thrived on being admired, that silence was louder than any punishment a courtroom could hand down. Marie's fall wasn't legal, but social, and in some ways, it was harsher. The officer-spouse community at Fort Liberty is its own world, a network built on appearances, alliances, and whispered judgment. When my story broke when the audio was played in that dining room, her carefully crafted image shattered overnight. Invitations stopped coming. Her phone calls were answered with polite excuses or not at all. The same women who used to hang on her every word at brunch now crossed the street to avoid her. In that world, reputation is currency, and hers had gone bankrupt. Meanwhile, I kept living. Not in hiding, not in fear. Just living. My report had moved through the proper channels, and I didn't have to chase it. The system did what it was supposed to do this time. Family advocacy offered me support services, but I didn't need counseling to know I had survived worse nights. CID investigators were professional, efficient. My father was notified of the legal consequences he might face. For the first time in my life, his actions didn't just echo in our living room, they echoed through official reports and legal pathways that didn't care about his pride. The recognition came unexpectedly. One cold morning, my CO called me into his office. I thought it was another update about the case, but instead he stood with a folded paper in his hands and a quiet expression. "You did something good, Staff Sergeant," he said. "That man outside the PX, the quiet way you stepped in, it didn't go unnoticed." I hadn't expected acknowledgement, but they gave it anyway, a private commendation from the battalion. No grand ceremony, no applause, just a few signatures on a document and a firm handshake that said, "We saw you. We stand with you." It wasn't about the award, it was about the weight lifting off my shoulders. Earl's life began to shift too. Once word spread about who he was, the system that had ignored him for years finally reached out. The Veterans Assistance Office arranged transitional housing for him inside the base community. It wasn't luxury, but it was warm, clean, and safe. He received medical care for his PTSD, and an old friend from the Special Forces community helped him get reinstated for benefits he'd lost track of years ago. I visited him one afternoon at his new housing unit. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air. He was sitting at a small kitchen table, a soft smile playing on his weathered face. He wasn't the man huddled outside the PX anymore. He looked steady. He poured me a cup of coffee without asking if I wanted one, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He didn't thank me again. He didn't have to. Some things don't need to be said twice. I moved into a permanent unit on base near the south gate. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, but every inch of it was mine. No shouting down the hallway, no door I needed to brace myself behind. The night I finished unpacking, I stood at the window and watched the glow of the perimeter lights stretch across the dark. Freedom doesn't roar. It breathes quietly. Marie tried to contact me a few times after that afternoon at my door. Long texts filled with apologies that weren't really apologies. Words about family and forgiveness and how none of this was what she wanted. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. She wasn't sorry for what they did. She was sorry for what they lost. My father tried once too, a single voicemail. "Reagan, I just want to talk." I deleted it before it finished. The community they had spent their lives impressing moved on without them. At the next officer event, I walked in alone. The air was different now. I wasn't the girl in the background of their power. I was the soldier people nodded to with quiet respect. Some of the wives approached me carefully, their voices lower than usual, as if the truth had made them uncomfortable. Some of the men who'd once shaken my father's hand avoided my eyes altogether. It didn't matter. I wasn't there for their approval. My father's name was removed from the local Veterans Honor Wall. His access remained revoked. The investigation wasn't flashy, but it was thorough. The world he built on fear and image was gone, and it wasn't because I screamed. It was because I told the truth once and refused to take it back. Earl started volunteering at the PX a few weeks later, greeting soldiers as they came and went. Some recognized him from old photos, some just saw him as the kind man with a quiet smile. One afternoon, I saw him slip $1 into a young private's hand when she didn't have enough for her lunch. It was a small act, but it mirrored the one that started everything. Life has a way of circling back like that. I never wanted revenge that burned down everything. I wanted accountability. I wanted the world to stop pretending. And it did. My parents lost the privileges they treated like birthrights. I gained something I'd never had the ability to breathe without asking permission. The last time I saw them from a distance, they were sitting on a bench outside the visitor's gate, waiting for someone to sign them in. They looked like strangers. The base they'd once ruled with appearances now ignored them. No one stopped. No one saluted. They were just two aging people sitting in the cold. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel fear or rage. I felt nothing at all. Justice didn't come in a single dramatic moment. It came in quiet, relentless waves that stripped away everything false. It came in legal documents and revoked access in whispers that turned into silence. It came in the way the system for once stood on the right side of the line. As I locked my apartment door that night and leaned against the frame, I thought about how small that house on the other side of town felt now, how loud their cruelty had been, how quiet my life was without it. The weight was gone, not because they changed, but because I stopped carrying it. Winter came quietly to Fort Liberty the way it always does. The trees around the base stood bare, their branches etched against a silver sky. The cold had a way of making everything still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I walked across the parking lot toward the PX, hands tucked into my jacket pockets, boots crunching softly on the frosted pavement. Inside, the warmth hit me like a soft exhale. The place smelled of coffee floor polish and something faintly sweet from the bakery section. At the corner near the coffee stand, Earl stood behind a small counter wearing a faded green sweater under his vest. He was pouring coffee into paper cups with the steady patience of someone who had learned to live at his own pace again. When he saw me, his face broke into a small, quiet smile. He held up a cup without saying a word. I walked over, took it from his hands, and leaned against the counter. The world didn't need grand gestures to feel right again. Sometimes, all it took was a warm cup of coffee and silence that wasn't heavy anymore. Earl looked healthier than the day I first saw him outside these doors. His hair was still gray and thin, but his eyes were clear, his shoulders less burdened. He'd built a rhythm here, a place to belong again. He asked how things were in his usual clipped way, and I answered in the same tone. We didn't need to talk about everything that had happened. The fact that we were both standing here breathing freely said enough. Outside the window, the wind pushed at the branches, scattering the last leaves across the lot. I sipped the coffee slowly, letting the warmth spread through my chest. Not so long ago, this place was the backdrop to the moment that split my life in two. One quiet act of kindness had unraveled a lifetime of silence and control. I used to think kindness was weakness. I used to believe that keeping your head down was the only way to survive. But that night changed everything. That moment at the PX, when I swiped my card without hesitation, didn't make me weak. It gave me the courage I didn't know I'd need. The people who once loomed so large in my life had become distant silhouettes. My father's name no longer echoed across the base. My mother's carefully polished image had faded from the circles she once ruled. They were living into the consequences they built themselves. And I was here, still standing, still breathing, no longer carrying the weight of their pride on my shoulders. I left the PX with the cup still in my hand. The cold air hit my face sharp and clean. Streetlights stretched long shadows across the pavement, reflecting off the polished buttons of my uniform. I paused just outside the door, watching my breath cloud in the air, and realized how different this winter felt. For the first time, it wasn't just a season. It was a reminder. In the military, we're taught about honor. It's written on posters painted on walls, stitched onto patches. But the truth is, not everyone understands what that means. Some people wear honor like a medal. Others live it quietly. Earl had carried his without applause. I had rediscovered mine the moment I refused to be silent. Honor isn't in ribbons or ceremonies. It's in how we treat the people who have nothing left. It's in the moments that no one sees the choices we make when it would be easier to look away. The wind grew stronger, tugging at my hair, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The base lights flickered in the distance, steady and familiar. I thought about everything that had happened since that night. About the girl I was the one who went home to a house where silence screamed louder than words. She was gone now. In her place stood someone who knew how to stand her ground, someone who no longer needed her parents' approval to breathe. I glanced back at the PX one more time. Through the glass, Earl was still at the counter refilling the pot. It felt right that he was here. This was where everything began, and where in a quiet way it also ended. As I walked toward my truck, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots sounded steadier than it ever had. The cold wind didn't bite this time. It carried something else with it, a strange kind of peace. Not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that lives beside it, steady and unshakable. I used to think my life would always be defined by their control, but it wasn't. It was defined by a choice, a simple act that led to a storm and eventually to stillness. That's what freedom felt like. Not loud, not blazing, just steady. If it had been you outside the PX that day, would you have stopped? Would you have handed over a few dollars and walked away? Or would you have let that moment change everything?